before we begin. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Share it in the comments. I always like to see how far these stories travel, okay? And if you'd like to hear more quiet journeys through the forgotten corners of history, you can subscribe. It's free, and it helps me keep telling these stories for you. Asterisk, the summer of 216 BCE had been dry, the kind of dry that left the ground pale and cracked, where dust clung to sandals and the air shimmered above the fields. Rome's senators had decided it was time to end the war quickly. For 2 long years, Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, with a mind as precise as a mapmaker's, had moved through Italy like a shadow. He had crossed the Alps with an army that should not have survived the journey. Yet it had. And now he was deep in Roman lands, feeding off their grain, burning their fields, breaking their alliances. The humiliation was heavy in the Senate chambers. 2 consuls, elected to share supreme command for the year, were given the task of stopping him. Gaius Terentius Varro, a man whose career had risen quickly and whose voice in the forum was always loud, favored direct, decisive battle. The other, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, was slower to speak, slower to act, and painfully aware of what had happened to Roman armies in the years before. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal had outmaneuvered them. Thousands had died. The names of those battles hung like dust in the air. Still, the Senate gave the order. Rome would not tolerate another season of waiting. An army of nearly 80,000 men, citizen soldiers, allies from the countryside, and a scattering of veterans, was assembled. It was the largest force Rome had ever gathered in the field. Every spear point, every shield rim, every strip of cured leather for the slings and bows had been prepared. The road south was long, but the Roman war machine could move in rhythm. The target was Cannae, a small settlement in Apulia. It was not a great city, not even a true fortress, but the land around it mattered. There was grain here, vast stores, collected from the fertile plains. In war, grain was not just food, it was the difference between movement and paralysis. Hannibal had taken the town, using it as a base and daring Rome to take it back. The march began under a harsh sun. Soldiers in the front ranks raised small clouds of dust with each step, and the rear ranks walked into it, breathing grit. The mule trains followed, laden with grain, tents, and the iron tools needed to build camp. Officers rode along the flanks, their eyes scanning for signs of the enemy. No one expected Hannibal to run. They knew he would fight. The question was how, and on whose terms. The Roman army's daily routine was a slow, methodical thing. At night, the camp was laid out with mathematical precision. The praetorium for command, the quarters for each cohort, the storage for food, the designated latrine pits on the downwind side. By dawn, they were up, folding leather tents, packing gear, and moving again. Passed through lands stripped bare by Carthaginian foraging parties. A few surviving olive trees stood like bone-white skeletons against the sky. Paulus and Varro alternated command each day. On Paulus's days, the march was cautious. Scouts went far ahead, signaling back if dust rose on the horizon. On Varro's days, the pace quickened, as though the mere act of moving faster would pull Hannibal into battle. Some soldiers muttered about the difference, but in the strict discipline of a Roman army, muttering was as far as discontent went. By the time they neared Cannae, the plain stretched wide before them, flat and open, with the river Ophidus winding through it in slow, lazy curves. Hannibal was already there, camped on the far side of the river. His men, fewer than half the number of Rome's, were arranged not in the dense, rigid formations the Romans preferred, but in a way that seemed looser, almost careless. It was a deception, though most in the Roman ranks did not yet realize it. The Carthaginian camp was a mix of peoples, hardened Iberian infantry with their short, curved swords, Libyan spearmen, whose shields and discipline were almost Roman in style. Gallic warriors with wild hair and long slashing blades. And war elephants, though fewer now than in the Alps crossing. Behind them, the dust of horse herds marked the Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen of the age. That night, as campfires flickered across both sides of the plain, the river Ophitis carried the sound of men, voices, and strange tongues, the ring of hammers on armor, the low grumble of beasts. The wind shifted, and the Roman camp caught the faint scent of wood smoke and roasting meat from Hannibal's side. Soldiers tightened their belts, not because they were hungry, but because they knew what was coming. Morning came, and with it Varro's turn in command. The sun had not yet burned the mist off the river when the Roman army began to form up. The legions massed in the center, dense and deep, as Varro intended to crush Hannibal with sheer weight. The allied cavalry took position on the flanks. Paulus, though it was not his day to command, rode the lines and spoke quietly to centurions. Urging discipline, Hannibal moved his men forward too, but in a shape that was not the solid block the Romans expected. Its center bulged outward toward the enemy, the weakest troops in the middle, stronger ones on the sides. To some Roman eyes, it looked like folly, almost an invitation to break the Carthaginian line. They did not yet see the trap hidden in the shape. The air was still, the sun already warm. The grain fields stood dry and brittle, their golden stalks waiting to be cut. Somewhere, a bird called over the plain, and then there was only the sound of shields locking and the muted thud of feet shifting in the dust. In that moment, before the signal to advance, the men on both sides knew that by evening, thousands of them would be gone, and yet no one moved. Not yet the decision to step forward, to commit tens of thousands of lives to the outcome of a few hours, would be made in moments. But those moments, the quiet before a battle, whose name would echo for centuries, are never recorded in detail. What passed through the mind of a soldier, staring across the flat Apulian plain at an enemy who had crossed mountains to kill him? Did he think of his family, his farm, the streets of Rome? Oh, did he focus only on the rhythm of breath, the grip on the spear, the sun rising higher over the river? No chronicle tells us exactly, but the silence of that morning, heavy and unbroken, was the last moment before Cannae became more than a place on a map. The first movement came from the Roman side, but the signal horns cut through the still air. Long, deep notes that rolled across the plain and seemed to hang there for a moment. Standards were lifted, and the legions began their slow, heavy advance. 80,000 men moving as one was not a sound easily described. It was not just the clatter of armor or the muted slap of sandals against the ground. It was the vibration of weight, thousands of shields and spears, the rumble of wagons at the rear, the muffled grunts of men carrying more than their bodies were designed for. The dust rose in a low haze, turning the sunlight into a pale, diffused glow. Hannibal's forces held their ground. The forward line, the outward curve of his formation, began to shift, drawing the Romans in. The center of his line, manned by Gauls and Spaniards, gave ground deliberately, step by step, as though yielding to Roman pressure. To the Roman front ranks, it seemed like the enemy was breaking. The deeper they pushed, the more the Carthaginian center bent inward, like a bowstring being drawn. On the Roman flanks, the cavalry engagement began. To the left, the Roman allied cavalry met Hannibal's heavy horse, Iberians and Gauls, in a brutal, compact fight. Horses screamed hooves, hammered the earth, and the clash of metal against bone filled the air. To the right, the smaller Roman cavalry force met the Numidians' riders without armor, carrying light spears, weaving and darting in and out like wasps. They did not seek to crash into their enemies. Instead, they harassed, drawing the Romans into scattered pursuit, pulling them away from the protection of the infantry. The heart of the battle, though, was in the Roman center. Varro's plan relied on raw force to drive forward and break the Carthaginian line before it could flex. And for a time, it looked as though it might work. Step by grinding step, the Roman mass pushed forward. Shields locked tight, glady, stabbing in short arcs. They advanced into the bulge of Hannibal's formation. What they did not see was that the bulge was no accident. Hannibal's veterans, the Libyan spearmen, waited on the flanks of this central arc. The Gauls and Spaniards in the middle pulled back. These Libyans began to pivot inward, closing around the Roman sides. The Romans, packed in tight and unable to maneuver easily, pressed forward without noticing that the corridor ahead was narrowing. The heat grew oppressive. Dust from thousands of feet hung thick in the air, coating throats, making each breath rasp. Waterskins had been drained early in the fight, and the sun climbed higher, striking shields and helmets until they burned to the touch. The battlefield, so open in the morning, now felt like a narrowing funnel. On the left flank, Hannibal's heavy cavalry began to push the Roman horse back, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. The Iberian and Gallic riders broke their opponents and drove them from the field. They did not pursue far. Instead, they wheeled in a great arc behind the Roman army, heading for the other flank. There, the Numidians were still tying up the Roman cavalry in scattered skirmishes. The arrival of the heavy cavalry crushed the Roman horse from behind. Those who survived scattered into the countryside, with both flanks clear of enemy cavalry. Carthaginian horse circled behind the Roman infantry. Now the trap was complete. Hannibal's Libyan spearmen pressed in from the sides. The Gauls and Spaniards in the center stopped retreating and held firm, and the cavalry closed the rear. 80,000 Romans were inside a tightening ring. Inside that mass, the noise was beyond measure. Men shouted orders that could not be heard. The press of bodies was so tight that many could not swing a sword or even raise a shield. Wounded men could not fall. They were held upright by the crush of soldiers behind them. For those in the middle ranks, there was nothing to see but the backs of the men ahead and a glint of enemy spears pushing in from all sides. The killing, when it began in earnest, was methodical. The Carthaginian infantry did not rush. They stabbed, withdrew, stepped forward, stabbed again. Roman discipline began to falter, not from cowardice, but from the sheer impossibility of movement. The formation that had been Rome's greatest strength, the solid, locked shield wall, became a prison. As the hours dragged on, the sun's heat turned the plain into a shimmering haze. The dead piled where they fell, and the living stumbled over them. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood, the dry bitterness of dust, and the sour tints of sweat. Somewhere, a standard fell, and the men who saw it knew that its bearer would never rise again. No one could see the whole battle now. Kay's man's world had shrunk to the few feet around him. The enemy in front, the press of comrades at his back, the hope that the line might break somewhere, anywhere, to let him breathe. But the Carthaginian ring held, tightening with each minute. Even at this stage, some Romans must have believed that sheer numbers would turn the tide, that the weight of so many trained soldiers could not be swallowed whole. Yet, as the sun passed its zenith and shadows began to lengthen, it became clear that the Roman army was no longer an army. It was a mass, and the mass was dying. Still, in the heart of that chaos, there were men who fought on, not for victory, but because stopping would have meant acknowledging that the day was already lost. What happens to courage when there is nowhere left to move? Asterisk. By the afternoon, the ring was so tight that there was no longer space to fall. Men were killed where they stood, their bodies held upright by the crush. The sun, which had risen into a haze of dust, now blazed down into a pit of heat, stench, and suffocating air. For those in the Roman ranks, The battle had become something that no longer resembled the ordered clash of armies. It was simply survival, 4 minutes longer, or seconds, if they were lucky. The Carthaginian infantry, veterans of years of campaigning, worked in silence. Their spears and short swords moved in steady rhythms, each thrust measured, each withdrawal precise. They were not in a hurry. The trap had been sprung hours ago, and it would not fail. Every few moments, the line pressed in another step, closing the circle, forcing the Romans into an ever smaller not for Hannibal. This was the culmination of planning that had begun long before the first blow was struck. His center had bent, exactly as he intended, drawing the Roman force deep into a position from which there was no retreat. His cavalry had done their work flawlessly, and now the killing was almost mechanical. Hannibal himself did not lead a charge or throw himself into the melee. He remained where he could watch, directing only when necessary. The battle was already decided. What remained was the grim task of ending it. Reports from ancient sources speak of staggering losses. Polybius, the Greek historian, writing within living memory of the war, claimed that over 70,000 Romans and their allies were killed that day, tens of thousands more taken prisoner. Even if the numbers were inflated, the scale of the slaughter was without precedent. It was not merely a defeat. It was the destruction of an army in the center of the Roman formation. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the cautious consul, fought to the last. Surrounded, he refused to flee. Varro, whose command decisions had brought the army into battle that day, escaped with a small group of horsemen, riding hard toward Venusia. His survival would earn him the Senate's gratitude for not abandoning the Republic entirely, but the shadow of Cannae would never leave his name. The prisoners, tens of thousands of them, were stripped of weapons and armor, herded together under guard. Hannibal, pragmatic in victory, offered to ransom them back to Rome. In the Senate, the proposal was rejected. Rome did not negotiate for prisoners while the enemy still camped on Italian soil. The message was clear. The Republic would endure, even without the men who had been captured. For those left behind in Rome, the news arrived slowly. Messengers came not in triumphant waves, but as lone riders, dust-caked and silent. They spoke in numbers, the dead, the missing, the few survivors, and in the names of senators' sons who would not return. The city wore no mourning in public, for the Republic's laws discouraged displays of grief that might weaken morale. But behind closed doors, families wept. The grain fields of Cannae still stood that evening, untouched by fire. The wind moved through them as if nothing had happened. In the days to come, the bodies would be left on the field, too many to bury quickly. Only later, when the air grew foul and the work of carrying birds was nearly done, would the survivors return to burn the dead. Cannae became more than a battle. It became a measure of loss. Rome would rebuild. It always rebuilt, but the names of those who fell here would never be recovered in full. In the years that followed, the Senate would change its recruitment laws, reaching deeper into the population, arming younger men, calling on allies to replace what was lost. Hannibal's victory at Cannae was complete, yet it did not end the war. Rome refused to surrender. The Republic, wounded and diminished, adapted, and in that refusal lay the seeds of Hannibal's eventual failure. But for the men who marched into Cannae and did not march out, Atia, the story ended on that flat, sun-baked plain. The sound of it, the horn calls, the clash of arms, the cries of men faded into the wind over the river, a UFIDUS in the century since. Generals and scholars have studied Cannae as a masterpiece of tactics, a perfect example of how a smaller force can destroy a larger one. But for those who were there, it was not perfection. It was heat, dust, and the slow closing of a ring from which there was no escape. And perhaps the truest question is not how Hannibal won, Why Rome, knowing his mind, knowing his record, still marched so willingly into the trap? Asterisk, the story of Cannae did not begin on the flat plains of Apulia. It began years earlier, on a different kind of ground, high, cold, and cruel. In the winter of 218 BCE, the mountains at Rome's northern border became the path for a march no one in Italy thought possible. Hannibal Barca, a man not yet 40, led his army across the Alps, carrying with him not only men and weapons, but an intent that was colder and harder than the stone under his feet. Before he reached Italy, Attila had already carved his name into Roman memory. His siege of Saguntum, a Roman ally in Iberia, had drawn the Republic into open war. But wars in those years often moved slowly, with seasons of marching and waiting. Campaigns defined as much by supply routes as by battlefield victories. Hannibal chose speed instead, while Rome prepared to fight him in Spain and in Gaul. He took the less guarded path, the one nature had guarded for millennia. The Alps were not a road, but a test. Snow choked the narrow passes. Avalanches took men and pack animals without warning. The mountain tribes, far from being impressed by his ambition, attacked from ridges above, rolling boulders and sending arrows into his columns. Men slept in thin tents or under the open sky, their cloaks stiff with frost by morning. Mules carrying grain and wine slipped from icy paths into ravines. And still Hannibal pressed on. By the time he emerged into the plains of northern Italy, his army was smaller but harder. The survivors were veterans, not just of wars, but of survival itself. They carried Iberian swords worn smooth from years, of used Libyan shields patched with new hide, Gallic spears with notched points. The elephants that had survived towering shapes with weathered hides were as much a weapon of fear as of war. Rome's first reaction was not panic. They had fought invaders before. The Republic's legions, trained and disciplined, were built to absorb shocks and recover. The Senate dispatched armies north to meet Hannibal, expecting to block him before he could move deeper into Italy. But Hannibal understood Roman thinking almost as well as they did themselves. He avoided their main forces, moving fast, choosing ground that bent to his advantage. At the Trebia River in 218 BCE, he lured a Roman army into icy water and then struck from hidden positions. The Romans, chilled, hungry, and hemmed in, broke. The next year, he did it again. At Lake Trasimene, he used the folds of the land to hide thousands of men in the mist. When the Romans marched along the narrow lakeside road, the hills came alive with his troops, closing off escape. It was not a battle so much as a trap snapping shut. Entire Roman units vanished into the water or into the hands of the enemy. Each time, Rome responded with determination. Each time, they raised new legions, tightened alliances, passed laws to fill the ranks. But with every loss, the shadow of Hannibal's name grew. For some in the countryside, it was easier to give him grain than to face his army. For others, especially in southern Italy, his victories hinted that perhaps Rome's grip was not unbreakable. By the spring of 216 BCE, Rome decided that caution had run its course. Waiting, avoiding battle, letting Hannibal choose the ground. These were not the ways of the Republic. The Senate wanted the war ended in a single, decisive blow. And so they raised the largest army Rome had ever put into the field. The numbers alone told a story of urgency. 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, drawn from Rome and her Italian allies. It was not simply a force to fight Hannibal. It was meant to crush him, to leave no possibility of retreat or recovery. Hannibal knew they were coming. Scouts, light riders, who could vanish into the hills and reappear miles away, brought word of their march. He chose Cannae not because it was a great city, but because the land was flat. The wind carried dust into the faces of an advancing army, and the nearby river could anchor part of his line. Every detail mattered to him: the direction of the sun, the dryness of the fields, the psychology of a Roman commander eager for glory. And so the long road to disaster narrowed, mile by mile, into a plain beside the river of Foetus, from the Alps to Cannae. The path had been marked not just by Hannibal's victories, but by Rome's refusal to learn from them. The question, as the summer of 216 drew near, was simple: would they change their ways in time? The decision to fight at Cannae was not a single moment in the Senate chambers, nor the order of one man. It was the accumulation of months of political pressure, public expectation, and the restless pride of a republic that did not think of itself as mortal dawned in early summer. The two consuls of 216 BCE, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, took command of the new army. Both had been elected knowing that the war would define their year in office. Varro was the son of a butcher, a man whose rise in politics was built on the support of Rome's common people. He spoke in the forum with a kind of direct confidence that made men believe victory was only a matter of will. Paulus was older, from a noble family, with a cautious nature and a respect for the slow grind of strategy. Between them stood the Roman system, alternating command, one day each, in the field. It was a system built on fairness, but in war, fairness could be a weakness. Decisions made on one day could be reversed the next. A cautious advance could be undone by a sudden rush forward. And an enemy like Hannibal could read those rhythms as easily as he read the land. The march south began in orderly fashion. The legions, arranged in their centuries and cohorts, moved along roads that had been used by armies for generations. Scouts ranged ahead and to the flanks, but Hannibal's cavalry always seemed to see them first. The Carthaginian general never gave Rome the chance to catch him unaware in the countryside. Villages emptied before the army's arrival. Some fled to the hills, taking what they could carry. Others had already given Hannibal what he needed: grain, wine, livestock, in exchange for being left unburned. Roman soldiers found empty houses, smoldering fields, and wells fouled to keep them from drinking. As the army moved, the tension between Varro and Paulus grew more visible. Paulus favored shadowing Hannibal, denying him supplies, forcing him into smaller fights. Varro saw this as weakness. To him, every day Hannibal remained in Italy was an insult. The Senate's message to the people had been clear: this army was raised to destroy Hannibal in open battle. Anything less would look like fear. The Carthaginian camp, when scouts finally located it near Cannae, was a picture of deliberate provocation. Hannibal had positioned his forces on the far side of the river of Foetus, in full view of the Romans. His banners caught the wind, his cavalry moved like restless shadows along the banks, and the supply trains came and went without concealment. It was as if he were inviting Rome to come and take him. Paulus saw the danger in the ground itself. The plain was wide and exposed, with little cover. The river bent in a way that gave Hannibal a secure flank. Worse, the prevailing summer wind, the vultureness, would blow dust from the dry fields directly into the faces of an advancing army coming from the west. He advised caution, perhaps even finding ground elsewhere. Varro overruled him on his day of command. To wait was to give Hannibal more time to raid and more time to appear invincible. The army had been built for this fight, and the people of Rome expected it. Camp was built on both sides of the river. Each night, soldiers could see the enemy fires burning across the water. Each day, the two sides tested each other with cavalry probes, neither willing to commit fully. Hannibal kept his main force ready, knowing the moment would come. On the eve of the battle, Hannibal walked the length of his camp. He spoke in different tongues to different parts of his army, in Punic to his Carthaginians, in Iberian dialects to his Spanish troops, through interpreters to the Gauls. He reminded them of the Alps they had crossed, the rivers they had won, the cities they had taken. He spoke of the Romans as stubborn but predictable, men who could be led to their own destruction if only the ground and the moment were chosen carefully. Across the river, the Romans sharpened weapons, oiled leather armor, and filled water skins. They did not think of traps. I thought of the morning to come, and of the banners that would be planted in victory. Hannibal's trap was not a sudden thing. It was a patient net, woven from years of watching Roman pride guide Roman decisions. By dawn, it would tighten, the night before the battle. The Roman camp was restless. Fires burned low to conserve fuel, and men lay on their cloaks, staring up at the dark without truly sleeping. Somewhere in the ranks, a soldier might have been thinking of his small farm outside the city, of the vines that would need tending in the autumn. Another might have thought of his children, their faces already blurred by time away. But for most, thoughts were fixed on the morning, on the weight of the shield beside them and the short sword they had carried for months. The sentries heard the Carthaginian camp too, the occasional clink of metal, the snort of a horse, the low rumble of voices in unfamiliar tongues. The river between them carried sound unevenly, turning shouts into whispers and whispers into echoes. Varro would have command in the morning. His orders, already given, left no doubt. The army would form at first light, cross to the southern bank where Hannibal's main camp lay, and bring the Carthaginian to battle. Paulus, bound by Rome's alternating system, could not override him. He could only offer his own counsel to the tribunes and centurions he trusted, urging them to keep discipline in the press of combat. Before the sun broke the horizon, the Roman horn signals cut to silence. Men rose, buckled on armor, and formed in their units. The air was still cool, but the sky to the east was already pale, promising heat by midday. Horses were led forward for the cavalry. The infantry adjusted their straps and tightened the grips on their weapons. The crossing of the Aufidus was done in parts, with the army already divided into two camps on either side. Varro's plan brought the bulk of the force to the southern plain, where they would mass in depth, more ranks than usual, to crush Hannibal's center. He believed weight and momentum would shatter the enemy before the flanks could become a danger. Hannibal had been ready for this moment since the first. Roman scouts saw his banners. His army formed deliberately, Gauls and Spaniards in the center, arrayed in a crescent that swelled toward the Romans. Libyan infantry on either side, held slightly back. Cavalry massed heavily on his left under Hasdrubal, and the swift Numidians on his right under Mashrabal. Asterisk to the Roman eye, the bulging Carthaginian center might have looked like weakness, a sag waiting to be driven through. But for Hannibal, it was the opening thread of the net. The wind began to rise as the sun cleared the horizon. The Vulcanus came from the southeast, steady and dry, carrying dust from the fields into the faces of the advancing Romans. Visibility thinned, eyes watered, throats grew coarse with grit. Still, the legions pressed forward, shields locked, feet moving in unison. Somewhere behind the Roman lines, a mule brayed, startled by the horn calls ahead. To a soldier in the middle ranks, it might have been the only sound that broke the rhythm of armor and sandals. The ground underfoot shifted from firm to loose, the dust puffing up with each step, marking their path toward the enemy. Asterisk. Before swords crossed at Cannae, before Hannibal's trap closed, the war was fought in furrows and threshing floors. No army, Roman or Carthaginian, moved without grain. Bread was not simply food. It was the foundation of endurance. And in the summer of 216 BCE, the fields of Apulia were heavy with it. Apulia was not Rome's richest province, but it was a place of broad, open plains where wheat could grow in the hot, dry summers and be stored through the year. From the perspective of a military planner, it was as much a weapon as a fortress. Whoever held the grain here could feed an army for months, or starve one into retreat. For Rome, supplying the vast force assembled to face Hannibal meant a constant stream of carts and pack animals moving from depots to the marching legions. The grain came in woven sacks, hauled from farm storage pits or granaries near the coast. Each sack weighed enough that 2 men could only carry it between them, resting it on a pole. Once in camp, the grain would be ground into coarse flour on small rotary mills, then baked into dense loaves or cooked into porridge thick enough to sustain a man through a day's march. The work was relentless. While soldiers drilled or scouted, slaves and camp followers hauled millstones, gathered firewood, fetched water, and baked. The ovens, built from clay and stones wherever the army stopped for more than a night, gave the air a constant scent of smoke and baking bread. It was not a pleasant aroma. The loaves were often burnt at the edges, the flour gritty, the water brackish. But it kept men alive. Hannibal understood this system. His own army lived by it too, though his supplies came from different sources. Moving far from Carthaginian territory, he relied on taking what he needed from the land, not just seizing grain, but controlling the mills, the wells, and the flocks of sheep and goats. Julia offered him a prize greater than gold, the stored grain of the local farmers. The seizure of Cannae itself was part of this strategy. The town, small and without grand walls, sat near a bend in the river Ophidas, but it had warehouses filled with grain collected as tax from the surrounding countryside. Hannibal's occupation of Cannae meant more than a symbolic presence. It meant he could feed his men while forcing Rome to march south to reclaim it. In the Roman mind, losing that grain was not just a military loss, but a blow to dignity. These were fields worked by Roman allies, taxed under Roman law. To allow an enemy to eat their harvest was to admit weakness. And so, grain, humble, dry, and measured by the sack, became one of the main reasons the Battle of Cannae would happen where it did. The transport of grain was as dangerous as any skirmish. Supply carts, heavy and slow, could be attacked by light cavalry or raiding parties. Rome stationed guards along the routes, but Hannibal's Numidian horsemen were masters at finding gaps, striking fast and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Losing a convoy meant more than the loss of food. It meant days of hunger, lower morale, and the slow erosion of readiness. In camp, grain was rationed carefully. Officers received larger portions, both as a privilege and because they were expected to remain fit for command. Ordinary soldiers sometimes traded part of their ration for wine, fresh fruit, or even better armor. The barter economy of a war camp, always in motion. The flour was mixed with water into dough, flattened, and baked on hot stones or in portable clay ovens. In bad weather, it was eaten half-cooked, the damp loaves, heavy in the stomach. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine battles as a matter of heroics, shields locking, cavalry charging, but none of it happened without the silent work of those who moved the grain. In Apulia, that summer, the fields stood ready for harvest, gold against the dry earth, their heads heavy and bending. Stalk was a measure of strength for whoever controlled it, and as Rome's legions drew near and Hannibal's camp spread along the far bank of the river, the real question was not only who would win the battle, but who would eat the harvest after it was done. Asterisk Hannibal did not come to Apulia simply because it was open ground for battle. He came because it was a granary, and armies are built on what their soldiers can eat. In the days before the Romans arrived in force, his men moved methodically through the countryside, not in the wild, burning raids that destroy for the sake of terror, but in a slower, more deliberate pattern, taking the uncut wheat from the fields, seizing the granaries, even collecting the millstones and storing them under guard. Without millstones, grain was little more than seed. They could be sown or eaten raw in desperation, but it would not sustain an army. The Carthaginian army that gathered around Cannae was a patchwork of peoples and diets. The Libyans were used to barley bread, coarser and darker than the Roman wheat loaves. The Spaniards brought flatbreads cooked quickly on heated stones, sometimes mixed with herbs or bits of dried meat. The Gauls ate not only bread but boiled grain, almost like porridge, heavy and filling. Hannibal had to feed all of them and feed their horses as well. Cavalry mounts consuming as much in fodder as a man might in bread. Grain was currency inside the Carthaginian camp. Officers could reward loyalty or punish failure with it. A few extra loaves could secure a soldier's service for a dangerous task, just as a half ration could keep him from wandering too far from camp. Even the war elephants, few in number, by this stage required their share of barley mash mixed with water and whatever greens could be found. The local farmers, caught between two armies, learned quickly that survival meant giving their stores to whoever stood at their gates. Some tried to hide grain underground in clay-lined pits, sealed with earth and brush. Others smuggled it out at night, carrying sacks to the hills where relatives or allies might keep it safe. Hannibal's scouts were thorough, and the Numidian cavalry could run down anyone spotted with a laden mule. For the Romans, watching from the far side of the river, every sack of grain carried into Hannibal's camp was another measure of time the enemy could stay in the field. Armies on half rations moved slowly and fought poorly. Armies well fed could wait for the perfect moment to strike. The Roman supply lines were longer and more exposed. Carts from the coast had to pass through land where Hannibal's cavalry roamed freely. Even a single raid could scatter the drivers, kill the mules, and dump sacks of grain into ditches. To counter this, the Romans began moving their supplies in larger, guarded convoys, but the delay this caused meant the army sometimes went a day or more without fresh bread. Men grew irritable, discipline thinned. The temptation to force a quick battle grew stronger. Hannibal understood this psychology. Hunger, even mild hunger, made men impatient. The more Rome struggled to feed its massive army, the more likely they were to cross the river and attack on ground he had chosen. In the campfires at night, both armies likely spoke of grain without ever naming it as the heart of the war. To the soldiers, bread was simply what they were owed for their service. To the generals, it was the true measure of power by holding Cannae and its stores. Hannibal was not merely provoking Rome. He was quietly making sure that when the battle came, his men would be ready, and theirs would be tired, underfed, and eager to end the waiting. The fields themselves, rippling gold under the Apulian sun, became silent witnesses. Neither side would burn them until after the battle. They stood in the heat, their harvest promised to whoever could hold them when the killing was done. And, in this way, the harvest of Apulia became as much a prize of war as the banners and standards carried into battle. When the Battle of Cannae ended, the plain was no longer gold with grain. The color had changed to trampled brown earth, to the dull red where blood had soaked in, to the pale dust kicked up by scavengers and wind. The fields that had been left standing through weeks of maneuver were now scattered with the debris of war, broken spear shafts, scarred shields, torn leather straps, and the silent forms of the dead. In the first days after the fighting, neither side had the strength to harvest. Hannibal's army, though victorious, was exhausted. The men who had fought since morning now lay under whatever shade they could find, tending wounds or simply sleeping. The horses were hobbled and fed. First, they would be needed to scout and patrol, and then the men turned again to the matter of food. The granaries of Cannae, still intact, became the center of activity. Guards were posted, and the grain inside was measured carefully. Some of it went straight to the mills. The small hand-turned stones worked from morning until night, producing flour for bread. The loaves baked in the days after Cannae were not a celebration meal. They were thick, uneven, and heavy, cooked in haste. and eaten in silence. Victory did not sweeten the taste. For the Romans, the loss of the grain was another wound. The survivors, who escaped to nearby towns, found themselves on reduced rations almost immediately, with their supply lines shattered and the countryside controlled by Hannibal's cavalry. They had to rely on stores in fortified cities or on shipments from further afield. Bread became scarcer, and what was available was often mixed with barley or ground legumes, filling but coarse and bitter. The local farmers faced their own reckoning. Smad already lost everything to Hannibal's foragers before the battle. Others had stored grain in hidden pits, but now risked losing it to whichever side reached them first. Hannibal's presence meant that they could sell or trade, but always at the price he dictated. Those who tried to move their grain toward Roman lines faced the same dangers as before: raiding parties, confiscation, and the possibility of being caught between skirmishing patrols. In the months after Cannae, the grain of Apulia would feed more than soldiers. It became the daily bread of the Carthaginian camp followers, the merchants who shadowed the army, the craftsmen repairing weapons and armor, and the herds of animals that still moved with the army. It was the quiet, constant heartbeat of Hannibal's presence in Italy. Rome understood this. In the years that followed, they began to change their approach. If they could not beat Hannibal outright, they would try to starve him out, cutting supply lines, burning fields, and fortifying towns so they could not be plundered. But in 216 BCE, those adjustments were still in the future. At Cannae, Rome had gambled on ending the war before hunger could become a weapon. And so, in a strange way, the grain had won its own battle. It had drawn both armies to this plain, kept Hannibal's men strong, and tempted the Romans into the fight he wanted. When historians look back at Cannae, speak of tactics, of encirclement, of the perfection of Hannibal's plan. But beneath it all, there is the quieter truth. The battle happened because of bread. Grain, dry, heavy, silent, had decided where tens of thousands of men would die, and in the long history of Rome, it would not be the last time a harvest shaped the fate of an empire. Before Cannae. Before the vast army marched into Hannibal's trap, there had been another Roman approach to the war, one that was slower, quieter, and too many in Rome unbearably frustrating. It was the strategy of Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucus, a man whose name would become a synonym for patience in war. Fabius was not a young general when the Second Punic War reached its height. His hair had long since turned white, and he carried the authority of decades in public service, consulships, a dictatorship, and years in the Senate. He had seen the Republic fight and recover from crises, and he understood that survival was often worth more than a single glorious battle. When Hannibal entered Italy in 218 BCE and won at Trebia and again at Lake Trasimene in 217, Rome was shaken. Entire armies had been lost, and the enemy moved almost at will through the countryside. In desperation, the Senate appointed Fabius dictator, a position reserved for moments when swift, absolute decision-making was needed. But Fabius's swiftness was not the kind Rome expected. He did not rush to bring Hannibal to battle. He did not seek the kind of decisive clash that could wipe away the stain of earlier defeats. Instead, he began a campaign of avoidance. He shadowed Hannibal's army without engaging it, harassed its foragers, cut off smaller detachments, destroyed supplies that could fall into Carthaginian hands. It was a strategy that required discipline and a thick skin. Many Romans hated it. The people wanted to fight, something that would restore their pride. To see the army moving alongside Hannibal without closing in felt like weakness. Even the soldiers chafed under the policy. They were trained to fight, not to march endlessly over scorched ground. Fabius, however, understood the danger of facing Hannibal on his terms. He knew that the Carthaginian general was a master at reading terrain, exploiting weaknesses, and turning Roman strengths against them. If Rome could not beat him in open battle, then Rome would have to deny him the opportunity. Hannibal, for his part, recognized the change immediately. This was not the impetuous Roman commander who could be lured into a trap. Fabius moved like a shadow, striking only when an advantage was certain. When Hannibal's army entered fertile regions, Fabius burned the crops before they could be seized. When Hannibal turned toward fortified towns, Fabius reinforced them and removed their surplus grain. The strategy began to work in subtle ways. Hannibal's cavalry could still raid, but large-scale foraging became harder. His men had to spread out farther, and the risk of being cut off increased. The Carthaginian army was still strong, but it no longer had the same freedom of movement it had enjoyed in the first years of the war. Still, in Rome, patience was wearing thin. Politicians accused Fabius of cowardice, of dragging out the war to keep himself in command. The public mocked him, giving him the nickname Conctata, the delayer. They meant it as an insult. But Fabius did not waver. He had chosen a path that was not about glory. It was about endurance, stretching the war until Hannibal's strength thinned and Rome's resources could rebuild. His approach, though, depended on a constant, careful balance. Stay close enough to threaten Hannibal, far enough to avoid his traps, and always deny him the supplies that kept his army alive. In the end, it was not the enemy that forced Fabius to change course. It was his own city. When his term as dictator ended, command passed to others who believed the time for delay was over. The memory of restraint would soon give way to the rush toward Cannae. But before that fateful march, Fabius's shadow campaign had bought Rome something more valuable than a victory: time. The question was whether they would use that time wisely. The trouble with Fabius's strategy was that it was as much a test of Rome's politics as it was of Hannibal's endurance. In the Senate, patience often looked like inaction, and inaction could be turned into a weapon by political rivals. Fabius was not without enemies. His slow-moving, resource denial strategy meant there would be no dramatic victories to trumpet. In the Forum, no triumphal processions through the city gates. For ambitious senators, this was a gift. They could accuse him of lacking courage, of fearing Hannibal, of letting the war drag on while Rome's allies lost faith. Some of these accusations found fertile ground among the people. Markets in the city buzzed with rumor that Fabius had secret understandings with the enemy, that he was prolonging the war to maintain his own influence, that he had no stomach for the fight. In a republic that prized decisive action, the idea of not striking an enemy within reach felt unnatural. Even within the army, there were grumblings. Soldiers trained for decisive clashes found the endless shadowing of Hannibal monotonous and exhausting. They wanted to test themselves against the man who had humiliated Rome's legions, not march parallel to him for weeks at a time. The smaller skirmishes, burning supply wagons, cutting down isolated foraging parties felt unsatisfying compared to the memory of full, ordered battle lines. Fabius, however, kept his focus. He had seen too many commanders undone by haste. He knew Hannibal's habit of choosing battlefields that favored him, his skill in bending the movement of enemy armies like a reed in water. And he understood something most of his critics did. Not Hannibal's greatest threat was not the destruction of Roman armies, but the erosion of Rome's alliances. Every town that defected to the Carthaginian side made his position stronger. By keeping Rome's remaining armies intact, Fabius was preserving not just soldiers, but the perception that the Republic could still defend its allies. Hannibal, for his part, tried to break Fabius's patience with calculated provocations. He raided deeper into Roman territory, burning crops and seizing livestock, knowing that each report carried back to Rome would fuel anger against the delayer. In one particularly symbolic move, he bypassed Fabius's main force and marched straight toward the general's own estates. His soldiers stripped the land, took cattle, and set fire to the fields. Yet, according to tradition, they left Fabius's villa untouched. Some claimed Hannibal hoped to sow suspicion, to make it seem as though Fabius had reached a private arrangement with them, if it was meant to unsettle the dictator. It did not work. Fabius refused to be drawn into the trap. He continued his measured pursuit, refusing to abandon the high ground or be lured into the open plains, where Hannibal's cavalry could dominate. But Rome's patience had limits. The Senate had appointed a master of horse under Fabius, Marcus Minucius Rufus, a man far less inclined to wait. Minucius scored a small, favorable skirmish against a detached Carthaginian force. The Senate and people seized on it as proof that bolder action could succeed. In an unprecedented move, they elevated Minucius to equal authority with Fabius, effectively splitting the dictatorship in two. The result was predictable. Minucius, eager to prove himself, engaged Hannibal directly and was swiftly outmaneuvered. His forces were nearly destroyed before Fabius arrived to save them. The episode reinforced Fabius's point against Hannibal. Caution was not weakness, it was survival. Still, his authority was never quite the same. When his term as dictator ended, command passed back into the hands of consuls, men chosen through political competition rather than unified wartime necessity. And among those who would soon hold command were men who believed that Fabius's caution had cost Rome precious opportunities. Hannibal had not defeated Fabius in the field, but he had managed to turn Roman politics against him. The delayers. War of endurance had worked, but only for as long as the city allowed it to. The change in command would set Rome back on the path to Cannae. When Fabius stepped down from the dictatorship, he did so without ceremony. There were no parades, no songs of victory, no trophies brought back from the field. His tenure had been marked not by battles won, but by battles avoided, and in the eyes of many Romans, that was not the stuff of glory. The new consuls of the following year, unshackled from his cautious oversight, began to plan for decisive engagements. They believed Rome's fortunes could be reversed with one great blow. To them, Hannibal's presence in Italy was a wound that could not be endured indefinitely. Fabius's policy of delay, they argued, was merely allowing the enemy to deepen his hold. In the months that followed, Rome returned to its old habits. Carthag's armies were concentrated. The focus shifted to set-piece battles, and the lessons Fabius had tried to impress about choosing ground carefully, about starving the enemy instead of chasing him, were pushed aside. The march toward Cannae began not just on the roads of Apulia, but in the rejection of the very strategy that might have prevented it. Yet, Fabius's reputation did not vanish entirely. Among experienced soldiers and older senators, there was a grudging respect for his restraint. They saw the discipline it had taken to face public scorn without breaking, to keep an army intact when every instinct of the Republic pushed toward immediate confrontation. Even Hannibal himself, if later accounts can be trusted, regarded Fabius as the one Roman general he could not trick into fighting on his terms. The people, however, preferred other heroes. They remembered the commanders who had charged into battle, even in defeat, rather than the one who had marched alongside the enemy without engaging. 4 years after his dictatorship, Fabius, the delayer, was still spoken with a hint of mockery in the marketplaces and taverns of Rome. Only after Cannae, the city began to reconsider his approach. In the aftermath of that disaster, when Rome once again faced the reality that Hannibal could not be easily destroyed, elements of Fabius's strategy returned. Armies began to harass, to avoid decisive battle, to burn crops and block roads. It was a bitter echo of what might have been done earlier. Fabius lived long enough to see this shift, though he did not gloat. Age had made him more measured still, and his role in the Senate remained one of steady counsel rather than passionate oratory. He watched the war drag on, knowing that time the same weapon he had tried to wield from the start would eventually wear Hannibal down in later generations. His name would be rehabilitated. Roman writers would hold him up as an example of wisdom, patience, and strategic depth. Military theorists would point to his campaign as proof. Sometimes the surest path to victory is to deny the enemy the battle they seek. But in the summer of 216 BCE, on the eve of Rome's greatest single loss, Fabius was no longer in command. The delayer had left the stage, and in his place stood men ready to give Hannibal exactly what he wanted: a great battle on open ground. And so, the man who had spent his command avoiding a trap would watch, powerless, as his city walked straight into one asterisk long before swords met on the plain at Cannae. Rome's soldiers were already fighting another kind of battle, one fought against distance, heat, and the steady erosion of strength with each mile. A Roman march was a moving city. Tens of thousands of men, along with mules, carts, engineers, smiths, cooks, and baggage handlers, wound their way along roads and tracks that varied from paved military routes to dusty, uneven trails. The legions did not simply walk, they carried the Republic on their shoulders. Each soldier bore a load that could weigh more than 30 kilograms, his armor of iron and leather, the curved shield that covered him from chin to knee, a short sword, 2 heavy javelins, a cloak, a helmet, rations for several days, a water skin, and personal tools like a pick or spade for building camp. Over time, this burden carved grooves into the shoulders, hardened the muscles of the back, and left the feet blistered and raw. In the summer of 216 BCE, the road to Cannae was long and dry. The sun burned in a sky so clear it seemed almost white, the heat radiating not just from above, but from the baked earth beneath their feet. Dust rose in fine clouds with every step, coating faces, sticking to sweat, turning hair the same dull color as the ground. The air shimmered in the distance, giving the illusion of water where none existed. Rome's military discipline demanded a strict order of march. The vanguard cleared the way, the main body followed, and the baggage train brought up the rear, protected by a small guard. Scouts ranged ahead, signaling back if they saw movement, but the slow, steady pace rarely changed. There were pauses, yes, but not for rest, only to let stragglers close the gap or to repair a broken cart axle. A man who fell too far behind might find himself alone in hostile territory. For Hannibal's cavalry, such a straggler was easy prey. Water was the most precious resource on the march. Wells along the route could be fouled or emptied by the enemy, and rivers, when reached, were sometimes too shallow or muddy to drink without straining the water through cloth. Soldiers learned to ration what they had, sipping instead of swallowing, keeping their mouths closed as they marched to reduce the dryness. Still, heat exhaustion claimed men without warning. They would stagger, drop their shield, and sink to the ground, comrades forced to carry them to the shade of a tree or the lee of a cart until they recovered, if they recovered at all. Food, though technically plentiful at the start of the march, was heavy and had to be carried in dried form. Wheat grain for grinding into flour, strips of salted pork, hard cheese. Camp followers carried some of it, but much of the burden was on the soldiers themselves. A man might roast a handful of grain in his shield over the evening fire, crush it into coarse meal, and mix it with water for a quick paste. It was fuel, not pleasure. The road to Cannae was not straight. It curved around hills, crossed shallow rivers, and wound through valleys where the air seemed to hold the heat like a closed room. At night, the men built camp with precision. Ditches dug, palisades raised, tents laid out in exact rows. Rest came only after the work was done. Day after day of this war at the body and mind. Blisters thickened into calluses. Shoulders ached under the constant weight, and the sound of marching feet became a kind of endless drumbeat in the skull. Yet the discipline held. The army moved because it had to, because Rome demanded it, because the enemy was ahead and the road would not walk itself. By the time the legions neared Cannae, they were not fresh troops stepping eagerly into battle. They were men already marked by the journey, their faces tanned and creased, their tunics stiff with sweat, their waterskins never quite full enough. The killing at Cannae would be swift compared to the long, slow death of the road, and in the heat that summer, it was hard to say which was more merciful. Marching in the summer heat of southern Italy was a test that wore away at the edges of strength until only discipline remained. The Romans prided themselves on endurance, the ability to keep formation, to follow orders without question, to bear discomfort without complaint. But the days before Cannae stretched that endurance thin. The Viae, Rome's military roads, were marvels of engineering, but not every path south was a paved artery of stone. Once beyond the main routes, the legions moved along dirt tracks beaten hard by centuries of hooves and cartwheels. In dry weather, these roads turned to powder. In heat, that powder rose with every step and hung in the air like a pale fog. The first ranks breathed it in fresh. Those behind inhaled what others had already exhaled. Dust mixed with sweat and the faint temps of iron from armor. The column moved at the military of passes. The military pace, a rhythm drilled into every soldier. Around 20 Roman miles in a day was standard, sometimes more if the ground was level and the need urgent. To fall behind was shameful. To break formation was worse. Centurions paced the flanks, fine staffs in hand, not only to keep order, but to remind the men that the army's strength was in its cohesion. The sun worked its own quiet attrition. Its helmets grew hot enough to burn the skin beneath. Its tunics, once soft, stiffened with dried salt from sweat. Leather straps on sandals softened with moisture in the morning and shrank tight again by afternoon, rubbing the same spots raw day after day. Small wounds, untreated, festered quickly in the heat as flies gathered on anything damp, and the smell of unwashed bodies became a constant companion. Asterix's thirst was managed, not relieved. Waterskins were rationed. Refills depended on the day's route. Sometimes a line of men would bend to drink from a narrow stream, cupping hands to filter the worst of the silt. Other times, they would scrape at the damp earth of a riverbank to let the water seep in cleaner, a trick learned from older soldiers. In desperate stretches, officers would order wine diluted heavily with what water remained. The acidity killed some of what might harm them. Meals on the march were more about timing than taste. The main pause came in the middle of the day when the heat was most oppressive. Soldiers sat in the shade of their shields, chewing at bread hardened to keep through travel, cord swallowing spoonfuls of grain porridge cooked at the last camp. Those with coin might buy dried figs or olives from camp followers trailing at the rear. For most, the food was fuel, taken without ceremony. It's just enough to quiet the hunger before the next stretch of road. The army's engineers marched too, carrying their own heavy loads, tools for repairing carts, shaping timber for bridges, digging camp trenches. Smiths walked beside mules, carrying anvils and charcoal, ready to patch a broken helmet or straighten a bent spearhead at day's end. Every trade was part of the march, every man a cog in the machine that had to keep moving. And yet, in the evenings, there was no collapse into rest. Camp, soon as the day's route ended, the camp had to rise. Ditches were dug around the perimeter, the soil thrown inward to form an earthen wall. Stakes were driven to support palisades. Tents were pitched in exact rows, and fires were lit for cooking. Only after this work done with sore muscles and blistered hands, could the soldiers ease their loads from their backs. Hannibal's cavalry, always nearby, was another reason for strict order. A column strung out along the road was vulnerable. A camp hastily built could be raided in the night. Every man knew that slackness could invite disaster by the time the legions reached the plains near Cannae. The fatigue was not just physical. It was in the eyes, in the fixed, forward stare of men who had learned that the road itself could be as much an enemy as the army waiting at its end. The next day would bring a battle unlike any they had fought before. But it would begin as every day on the march began, with the weight of armor on sore shoulders and the long, patient rhythm of feet on the road. Asterisk, the plain of Cannae did not appear suddenly. It revealed itself slowly, mile by mile, as the hills fell away and the horizon opened into a wide sweep of pale earth and brittle stalks of wheat. The river Ophitis curved lazily to the east, its waters low in the summer heat, a thin ribbon between two armies that would soon turn the ground red for the soldiers of Rome. The sight was not met with awe, but with the dull recognition of a destination reached. There was no cheer, no triumphant call. They simply kept moving, because stopping was not yet allowed. The march into the plain was as methodical as every mile before it. Standards were planted, cohorts broke off into assigned spaces, and the camp began to rise. Even here, within sight of the enemy, the work came first. Trenches dug deep enough to slow a horse, palisades set in tight rows, gates placed for quick access to the river. The ground was dry and hard. The picks struck sparks. Hannibal's camp was visible across the water. His cavalry moved like shadows along the far bank, sometimes pausing to watch, sometimes vanishing into the heat haze. The Carthaginian banners stirred faintly in the wind, their colors dulled by distance. By now, the Roman soldiers carried more than just the weight of their gear. The march had etched its marks into them, raw shoulders where straps had rubbed through tunics, cracked lips from rationed water, calluses split and reopened on their feet. Some bore the deeper ache of strained muscles that never had time to heal. The daily grind had stripped away excess flesh and left lean, sun-browned frames, men built by necessity for endurance, but endurance with a cost. The nights on the march had been short. The heat had been long. Sleep in camp was never deep, broken by the calls of sentries, the clank of weapons being checked, the uneasy dreams that came from knowing the enemy was near. In the Roman way of war, arriving at a battlefield was never the beginning of rest. It was the beginning of preparation for the fight. Armor was inspected for cracks, straps replaced, weapons sharpened. The soldiers cleaned dust from the grooves of their shields, knowing that even a small flaw could mean a spear slipping through. Centurions walked the lines, checking not only equipment, but faces, gauging who was still strong and who might falter. Some of the men looked across the river and saw only the enemy. Others looked at the flat ground and thought of the march, of how many days it had taken to reach this place, of the heat that had not let up, of the meals eaten in haste and the water swallowed too sparingly. The journey itself had been a campaign, one fought without glory and without song, but one that had already claimed its share of strength on the eve of battle. The legions were not as they had been when they left Rome. They had arrived leaner, harder, and more disciplined, but also worn with the fine edge of readiness dulled by the constant grind of the road. In the stillness before dawn, when the wind carried the smell of dust and dry grain, the march was over. The next step would not be along a road, it would be into history. Asterisk, the river Ophitis was never meant to be part of a legend. It was a working river, its slow, brown current feeding the fields of Apulia, turning millstones, watering flocks, and marking the edges of farmland. In most years, it carried little more than the runoff of the surrounding hills to the Adriatic Sea. But in the summer of 216 BCE, it became the boundary between two of the greatest armies the ancient world had ever assembled on Italian soil. The Ophitis did not roar or glitter. In the dry months, it shrank, its banks cracked and pale in places, its edges marked by reeds and the footprints of animals that came to drink at dusk. In the mornings, mist sometimes drifted low over the surface, the cool air touching the warmer flow beneath. It was a quiet place, the kind of place where, in other years, fishermen might stand barefoot in the shallows, casting a net, or children might wade in to escape the heat. Hannibal had chosen his camp on the southern bank, near a bend where the river curved gently eastward. The position gave him a fixed point to anchor his army's flank and a source of water that could be controlled. The Romans camped partly on the opposite bank and partly on the same side, their presence stretching along the water's edge like a mirror of their enemy. The river changed the rhythm of the days before the battle. Men came to fill waterskins, to wash dust from their faces, to lead horses in for a drink. At night, both sides could hear the other across the water, the muted voices, the occasional clash of metal, the whinny of a restless mount. The Ophitis carried sound unevenly, making a single laugh seem close one moment and far away the next. Its flow also marked a subtle division in the thinking of the two armies. For Hannibal, it was a shield. For the Romans, it was an obstacle. Its cross in force meant breaking formation. And breaking formation meant risking confusion under the eyes of an enemy who thrived on exploiting it. And yet, the river was not grand enough to stop either side if they truly wished to cross. It was not a natural fortress, only a feature of the land useful, but not decisive on its own. Its true power lay in what it represented, the line between waiting and acting, between the days of marching and the day of killing. In the afternoons, when the sun burned brightest, the Ophitis ran sluggish and warm, the shallows glinting in the light. The soldiers who stood watch on the banks could see the reflection of their spears in the water, bent and shimmering with the current dot. No one could know that in a matter of days, that same current would carry more than reeds and drifting leaves. The river had been here long before Hannibal, long before Rome's ambitions reached this far. It would remain long after the banners were lowered and the voices silenced. But, for the moment, it was a silent witness, its surface unbroken except for the slow turning of the flow, as steady and indifferent as time itself. The Ophitis was the only constant in those restless days before the battle. Everything else, the movement of troops, the shifting lines of sentries, the daily probing skirmishes, was in motion. The river alone kept to its rhythm, carrying its slow burden eastward. Every morning, before the sun cleared the horizon, men from both camps came to its edge. The Romans approached in disciplined files, waterskins slung over their shoulders, shields slanted on their backs. Hannibal's men came in smaller knots, their steps lighter, their voices in a mix of languages. The same reeds that had brushed against fishermen's legs in peacetime now hid soldiers from the view of their enemies on the opposite bank. The water was not clean. Extreme animals had crossed and trampled the banks, stirring mud into the war flow. The Romans strained it through cloth, filling jars and skins that would be passed hand to hand back into camp. The Carthaginians did the same, but their horses often drank straight from the shallows, nostrils dipping and blowing out small clouds of spray. Some men, stripped to the waist, crouched to wash away the dust and sweat of the march. The water felt shockingly cool at dawn, but by midday, the surface warmed to match the heat in the air. A thin, earthy smell rose from it, the scent of clay banks and sun-baked reeds. There were moments, rare and brief, when soldiers from opposite sides locked eyes across the narrowest stretches. Neither spoke. The river was an unspoken truce in those moments. Its surface, a thin separation between men who might face each other. Hours later, in the press of battle, sometimes a Roman might see a Carthaginian lean down to drink and think. For a heartbeat, not of the war, but of the simple fact that thirst was the same for all men. Yet the river could not be a bridge for long. By mid-morning, the guards along the banks were alert. Shields slung forward, eyes scanning the opposite side for movement. The Ophitis had no high banks here, no steep sides to defend. Attack across it would would be sudden, fast, and close. Armies knew it, and so the waters were watched as carefully as any road or hill. Hannibal used the river for more than water. 8. He anchored his left flank to it, making it harder for the Romans to encircle him. He knew the summer wind, the vultureness, would carry dust into Roman faces if they crossed from their side, a kind of small, natural advantage that became deadly in the heat of battle. The Romans saw it too, but on Varro's day of command, it would not be enough to dissuade him at night. The sound of the river was one of the few constants under the hum of the camps. It was a low, shifting murmur, never silent, but never loud enough to mask the noise of distant movement. Men on watch learned to hear the difference between the splash of a fish and the softer sound of a boot. Sinking into the mud, the Aufidus was not a great river by the measure of history. But here, in the summer of 216 BCE, it was the line that both joined and divided, the source of life for two armies, and a quiet reminder that even in war, survival began with the simple act of drinking, and soon the same water that filled their skins would carry the blood of both. Asterisk, when the Battle of Cannae finally broke, the Aufidus was no longer just a line between armies. It became a backdrop to the slaughter, its quiet surface indifferent to the chaos on its banks. The fighting began far from its edge. But as the Carthaginian ring tightened around the Romans, men were pushed, driven, and forced toward the river. Some tried to break through to reach it. Desperate for a way out, they imagined crossing to safety, the cool shock of water on their faces. But the Aufidus offered no refuge. On its far bank, enemy cavalry waited, ready to cut down any who made it across. Others were driven into it unwillingly. In the crush of bodies, men stumbled backward into the shallows, the weight of armor dragging them down when they lost their footing. A man who fell in deep water with a shield strapped to his arm often did not rise again. Horses thrashed as they slipped on the muddy bottom, thwarting riders who were swallowed by the current. The water turned dark where blood mixed into its flow. Reeds that had brushed against soldiers' legs in the days before now tangled around the bodies of the fallen, holding them in place as the current tugged gently toward the sea dot. By evening, the river's banks were littered with the debris of war shields half buried in mud, broken spear shafts caught in the reeds, sandals abandoned in the panic of flight. The water carried some of it away, but much of it remained, trapped in the slow bends where the flow could not wash it clean. In the days after, Cetus became part of the grim work of the living. Survivors came to drink cautiously, avoiding the places where the dead had drifted. Carthaginian soldiers waded in to retrieve weapons, their movements slow in the heavy water. The bodies of men and horses caught in the reeds were pulled out or burned where they lay to keep disease from spreading through the camps. And yet, even with the memory of battle fresh, the river did what rivers do. It kept moving. Its current pulled downstream, away from the plain, past the fields that had seen the armies march, past villages where people whispered of the slaughter. By the time it reached the Adriatic, the blood it carried was invisible, dispersed into the vast salt water. Years later, the Aufidus would still run the same course. Farmers would again bring their flocks to drink. Children would wade in the shallows, and reeds would sway in the summer wind. The battlefield would fade into the soil, and only the river would remain unchanged in its purpose, silent in its witness. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth of such places. The land and the water, remember? But they do not speak. It is left to us to imagine what they saw. Asterix, for most Roman soldiers, the first time they saw a war elephant was not in battle, but at a distance, a dark, shifting shape on the horizon, larger than any living thing they had known. Elephants were not creatures of Italy. They belonged to far-off lands, to Africa and parts of India, two places most Roman peasants knew only through rumors carried by merchants. Hannibal had brought them across the Alps years before Cannae, though By 216 BCE, their numbers had dwindled. The survivors were living relics of a march no one thought possible. To the men of Apulia, they seemed unnatural. In the fields near Cannae, their height made them visible above the moving ranks of infantry, their ears flaring and folding, their trunks curling to test the air. Even standing still, they were never truly motionless. Tails swished at flies. Feet shifted under their weight. Great heads turned slowly to follow movement. In battle, they were not just muscle and tusk. They were trained weapons, Carthaginian handlers, often from North Africa, where elephants were captured and broken for war. Guided them with voice commands, sharp taps from hooked goads, and sometimes with nothing more than the pressure of a knee against the animal's neck. Armor plates could cover their heads. Tusks might be tipped with bronze, and on their backs. Light wooden towers could hold archers or javelin throwers. But the true weapon was fear. Horses panicked at the smell of them, refusing to go near. Infantry lines could waver just at the sight, men imagining what it would be like to be trampled under such a weight. The sound of an elephant's trumpet carried across the field like nothing else, deep, sudden, and unnerving. For the Romans, there were ways to fight them, but few soldiers had practiced these in real combat. The ideal was to wound the elephant, enough to make it turn and run back through its own lines, causing chaos. Spears aimed at the eyes or at the underside of the trunk could kill. But getting close enough to land such a blow meant facing not only the animal, but the men defending it. By the time of Cannae, Hannibal's elephants were fewer and not used in the main killing trap. They served instead as part of the intimidation position where their size and presence could be seen early, meant to unsettle rather than decide the battle outright. Yet, even in this reduced role, their impact on morale was real. The Roman ranks, hardened by years of campaigning, still found their eyes drawn to the slow, deliberate movement of the beasts across the field in the evenings before battle. The elephants were kept at the edges of the Carthaginian camp, away from the noise of the main body. They ate prodigiously, grain mash, green fodder, sometimes even stripped branches brought in from miles away. Water was fetched for them in barrels, each beast drinking more than a dozen men could in a day. They were, in every sense, living engines of war, costly to maintain, dangerous even to their handlers, and yet valuable for the fear they inspired before a single spear was thrown, and for the Romans who would stand against them. The question was not only how to fight, but whether their courage could hold steady when the ground itself seemed to shake beneath their feet. When the day of battle came, the elephants were among the first shapes visible through the heat haze, dark against the pale fields, their silhouettes swaying with each step. They moved slowly, not in the sudden rush of cavalry, but with a steady, placable pace that suggested they would not stop for anything in their path in the Roman front ranks. Veterans tried to keep their voices.com, warning younger soldiers not to break formation. They spoke of keeping shields locked, of aiming at the handlers rather than the beasts themselves, of letting the line absorb the shock. But even these instructions carried an unspoken truth. Nothing in ordinary soldiering prepared a man for facing a creature that could lift and toss a fully armed fighter as though he were a child. The Carthaginian handlers urged their mounts forward, calling out in languages strange to Roman ears, sharp syllables mixed with long, low hums meant to steady the animals. The elephants' trunks lifted and swung, testing the air, sensing the lines of men ahead. From their backs, archers and javelin men scanned for gaps, ready to pour missiles into the Roman ranks at the moment of contact. The first moments of impact were always the worst. An elephant's charge was less about speed than about unstoppable weight. A single step could crush a man's foot through the sole of his sandal. A single swing of the trunk could knock the breath from his body before he even raised his sword. The spears broke against their hides unless driven with perfect force and precision. Even then, a wounded elephant did not always fall. It could thrash wildly, turning the ground into a chaos of trampling feet and screaming men. Asterisk. Roman tactics against elephants were simple in theory, but brutal in execution. The aim was to wound the animal where it was most vulnerable: the eyes, the underside of the trunk, the soft flesh at the joints. Some soldiers carried specially shaped pila meant to pierce deeper, but in the noise and dust of battle, hitting the right spot was almost impossible. Sometimes the only chance came when an elephant panicked. If blinded or badly injured, it might turn back, crushing its own lines in its confusion. This was as dangerous for Carthaginians as it was for Romans, and more than one battle in history had seen the tide turn when war elephants fled into friendly troops. Hannibal's handlers knew this and tried to keep the animals under tight control, using goads, ropes, and voice commands to guide them even in the frenzy of combat. At Cannae, the elephants were not massed for a single devastating charge. Instead, they moved along the flanks, adding to the pressure on Rome's cavalry and reminding every man in the field that the enemy's reach extended beyond the familiar bounds of man and horse. Their presence forced the Romans to divide their attention, to guard not only against human opponents, but against the towering shapes that could crush a formation with a single push. For the men who stood nearest, the air was different. It carried the heavy, musky scent of the elephants, mixed with the sharp tints of sweat and leather from the riders. The ground trembled faintly with each step, and the sound, a deep, hollow thud, was felt as much as heard. To face an elephant was to face something that seemed beyond the scale of ordinary war. A man could hate another man, could read his eyes, could imagine striking him down. But the beast was different, ancient, immense, and unmoved by the politics and grudges that had brought the armies here. It did not know Rome. It did not know Hannibal. It only knew the commands of the handler on its neck, the weight of the armor it carried, and the path it had been driven down. And still, for the Romans in its way, it was as much an enemy as the man who ordered it forward. Asterisk. By the end of the day at Cannae, the elephants were no longer the looming figures that had first appeared through the morning haze. Some still stood with their handlers, sides heaving, ears flapping to cool the heat from their bodies. Others lay on their sides in the dust, their great forms strangely still. The din of battle long since faded from their ears. They had not been the deciding factor in Hannibal's victory. The trap that crushed Rome's legions had been set by men, not beasts. But their presence had shaped the field in ways harder to measure. On the flanks, their slow advance had forced the Roman cavalry into tighter formations, robbing them of space to maneuver. In the minds of the infantry, their very existence had added another layer of strain, another distraction in a battle already thick with danger for Hannibal's army. The surviving elephants were valuable, not just as weapons, but as symbols. In the days after the battle, they were walked through the Carthaginian camp, their presence a reminder of the long journey from Africa, of the victories along the way, of the reach of Carthage itself. Soldiers who had fought beside them touched their flanks with a kind of rough respect, aware that these animals had endured the same dust, thirst, and danger as any man. The Romans, in their retreat, spoke of the elephants with a mix of resentment and grudging admiration. They had not broken the legions, but they had been part of the enemy's greater design. One more piece in the puzzle of a general who seemed to use every resource, every detail to his advantage. Caring for the elephants after battle was its own kind of campaign. Wounds were washed with water fetched from the Aphidus, and handlers smeared them with mixtures of oil and crushed herbs to keep flies away. Feeding them required whole teams of men gathering fodder from the countryside, stripped branches, bundles of reeds, sacks of grain mash. Our needs were constant, their upkeep a reminder that every victory brought with it burdens as well as rewards. In time, some of these elephants would be seen again in later campaigns, their shapes familiar, to those who had faced them before. Others would be lost to sickness, injury, or the simple wear of long marches. Yet the memory of their presence at Cannae would remain. For the men who had stood in their path, the sound of an elephant's trumpet in battle would never be forgotten, not because it was the deadliest noise on the field, but because it was like hearing war itself take a shape larger than human, a shape that could walk straight through the line between courage and fear. And long after the battlefield was quiet, when the dust had settled back into the soil, and the reeds by the river grew tall again, the story of those beasts would travel with the survivors, in taverns, in markets, in campfires, on other campaigns. They would tell of the day the ground shook under the feet of animals from another world, and of how they stood, or tried to stand, when the giants came. Asterisk, when the sun set over the plain of Cannae, the killing was not truly over. The moans of the wounded still carried on the wind, and the slow, deliberate work of stripping the dead had begun. But for Rome, the battle's impact would be felt first, not in the fields of Apulia, but in the streets of the city, days away. The messengers left before the final count was known. They rode hard, spurring their horses through the night, avoiding the main roads when they feared Carthaginian scouts might be near. Their saddlebags carried no trophies, no banners, only words, and those words were heavy enough to darken the heart of a city. In Rome, news of battles often arrived wrapped in ceremony. A victorious general might send a herald ahead to announce his approach, drums and trumpets heralding the spoils to come. But when the riders from Cannae reached the gates, there was no such prelude. The guards on duty recognized the dust-caked cloaks, the hollow stairs, and let them pass without question. They went first to the Senate. It was there, behind closed doors, that the scale of the loss was spoken aloud. Tens of thousands dead, entire cohorts erased from the rolls, consular officers fallen, noble sons among the uncounted. Polybius would later record numbers so vast they seemed impossible, but even the lowest estimates meant that nearly every family in Rome had lost someone, a father, a brother, a cousin, or a son. The Senate faced the first, most human question: how much to tell the people? In times of war, information was a weapon. Panic could unravel the city faster than any army at its gates. And so, the first announcements were careful, speaking of heavy losses in strategic withdrawals rather than the totality of the disaster. But in a city where the forum was a constant exchange of rumor, the truth could not be contained for long. Women went to the gates to meet returning stragglers, not organized units, but small knots of survivors who had slipped away in the chaos, or been spared as messengers. They came on foot, limping, armor dented, faces burned by the sun and streaked with dust. Some walked with their gaze fixed ahead, speaking to no one. Others found their voices only when they recognized a face in the crowd, shouting a name in the hope of an answer. There were no official casualty lists, no orderly roll calls to comfort the waiting. News spread in fragments. One man saying he had last seen a neighbor's son alive by the riverbank. Another swearing he had watched him fall. Bished in the narrow streets, these fragments collided. Anne's families clung to any scrap of hope until certainty came, often in the form of silence. Rome's traditions did not permit open mourning in times of crisis. The Republic prided itself on public composure. Grief was to be borne privately, behind closed doors, so as not to weaken the resolve of the city. But the absence of public wailing only made the quiet heavier. Behind the heavy wooden doors of patrician homes, behind the curtained windows of the insulae, Rome wept in those first days. Before strategy could be discussed, before armies could be raised, the loss was measured in empty seats at the family table, and the city, though it still stood, felt smaller. Asterisk, in the days after the news from Cannae reached Rome, the city moved in a strange, restrained silence. People still went to the markets. The Senate still met. The temples still opened their doors at dawn, but everything seemed thinner, the voices lower, the steps slower. Rome had laws and customs for mourning, but they were not meant for a loss of this scale. If the city had allowed every family to wear the dark robes of grief, the streets would have been nothing but black. And so the Senate, following tradition, forbade public displays of mourning beyond a set number of days, hoping to keep the appearance of resilience. The decision was practical in its intent, but cruel in its effect. Mothers who had lost sons at Cannae were expected to carry on their household duties as though the news had not come. Widows were told to resume their daily routines, their voices kept even, their tears private. Grief became something hidden, not absent, pressed into the walls of the home, like smoke in the plaster. The temples filled in those days, not with processions of celebration, but with individuals in small groups bringing offerings. The prayers were quiet, often spoken under the breath. Some asked the gods for protection for the soldiers still in the field. Others, more bitter, questioned whether the gods had turned away entirely. In the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, a scribe recorded a rise in votive offerings, small clay figurines, coins, scraps of jewelry, given by those who had little else left to give. Asterisk. The Senate faced the harder questions in closed session. Hannibal's victory meant he was free to move where he wished in southern Italy. Allies might see the disaster as a sign that Rome could no longer protect him. Every decision in those first weeks was made with two goals: to prevent the loss of more allies and to raise new armies as quickly as possible. That meant lowering the age for military service, calling on men who had never held a spear, and summoning those who had already served and returned to civilian life in the poorer districts. The conscription officers came to the insulae, reading names from lists. Some men stepped forward without hesitation, driven by duty or vengeance. Others went quietly, knowing they had little choice. Families watched in silence as fathers and elder brothers were taken from their homes, not knowing whether they would ever return. There were also the prisoners, tens of thousands of Romans taken alive at Cannae, now in Hannibal's hands. Word reached the city that he was willing to ransom them. It was a delicate offer, heavy with political meaning. The Senate debated it fiercely, and in the end, they refused. To pay for their return, they argued, would admit weakness and encourage the enemy to capture more. It was a decision that condemned many of those men 2 years in captivity, some never to see Rome again. And yet, for all the weight of loss, there was no collapse. Grain still moved into the city. The workshop still rang with the sound of hammers shaping armor and spearheads. The roads still saw the movement of carts and messengers. Rome's strength lay not only in its armies, but in its ability to act as though defeat was only a temporary obstacle. It was a city without many of its sons, but it was still a city that intended to endure. Asterisk. In the weeks after Cannae, Rome moved with a kind of grim efficiency. The grief had not lessened. It never could so soon, but it was buried under the weight of preparation. The city's survival depended on replacing what had been lost, and the scale of that task was unlike anything the Republic had faced in living memory. The Senate ordered the levy to be expanded beyond its usual limits. Boys, barely in their mid-teens, were enrolled alongside men in their 40s who thought their soldiering years long behind them. Freedmen, who had previously been excluded from regular service, were offered arms. Even slaves were promised freedom if they would take the oath and serve in the legions. Armor was pulled from storage, repaired where possible, and reshaped to fit smaller or older bodies. The training grounds outside the city were soon filled again, though the sound was different now. The barked orders of centurions carried over the fields, but the answering voices were higher, younger, less certain. Wooden swords struck against shields in the practice yards. the blows ringing hollow against the memory of the veterans who had once stood there. Allies from the countryside sent contingents of their own, though the faces of these men often showed the same losses Rome had suffered. Every allied town had names to mourn from Cannae, and everyone knew that sending more meant risking another generation. Still, they came bound by treaties, by necessity, and by the knowledge that Hannibal's victories would not stop at their neighbors' borders. Inside the city, work shifted toward the war effort. Smiths worked by lamplight to shape spearheads and mend chainmail. Women gathered cloth for tents and bandages. Merchants moved quietly through the forum, arranging for grain and supplies to be stored where new armies could draw on them. Even the temples played a role, releasing some of their sacred funds for military use, a sign of how deep the crisis ran. For those who had lost sons, the sight of new recruits marching out through the city gates was a reminder that Rome's survival came at a price that would never be evenly borne. Some watched in silence. Cannae, others stood in their doorways, calling blessings after the boys who now wore the red cloaks of the legion. And always, in the background, there was the knowledge that Hannibal still remained in Italy. His victory at Cannae had not ended the war. It had only reshaped it. Rome could not meet him in another battle of that scale. Not yet, but the city would keep the war alive in smaller engagements, in sieges, in the slow reclaiming of ground. Years later, when the veterans of those rebuilt legions told their stories, they often spoke of the campaigns that followed, of reclaiming towns, of finally forcing Hannibal to withdraw. But they also remembered the summer of 216 BCE, not just for the defeat, but for the moment when Rome, stripped of so many of its sons, chose to fill the empty ranks and keep marching. It was the moment the Republic proved that it could survive, not because it avoided loss, but because it refused to stop after it came. Asterisk, when the dust of Cannae began to settle, not all who had stood in the Roman ranks lay dead on the field. Tens of thousands had been surrounded before the final killing began, their weapons stripped from their hands, their shields kicked away. The Carthaginian cavalry herded them together in tight knots, spears leveled at their backs, and a march into captivity began. For many of these men, the shock was as heavy as the heat. They had not fled. They had been caught in the crush of Hannibal's ring, with no space to swing a sword or break through. Now, unarmed and ringed by guards, they walked under a sky that had been theirs only hours before. Hannibal did not slaughter them. Killing prisoners consumed time and strength, and there was more value in keeping them alive. They could be used for ransom, exchanged for his own captured soldiers, or employed as bargaining tools with Rome's allies, teeming, perhaps, in the minds of some Carthaginian officers. There was the faint hope that these prisoners might one day refuse to fight for a republic that had abandoned them. The first stop was not far, a makeshift holding ground where they were counted, searched, and divided. Officers were separated from common soldiers, their armor and cloaks taken as trophies. The survivors were given water, but little food. The Carthaginians had their own army to feed, and the prisoners would be kept alive on the smallest rations possible in the Roman army. To be taken alive was not an honorable fate. Death on the field, even in defeat, was seen as the cleaner end. Captivity meant uncertainty, not knowing if one would ever see the city again, or if one's name would be spoken in the past tense before the Senate had even debated a ransom. Days later, they were on the move again, guarded by mixed detachments of Iberian infantry and Numidian horsemen. The march south was slower than any military advance, slowed by the sheer number of captives and by the need to avoid Roman patrols. Each night, they were penned in open ground with watchfires burning on all sides. The landscape changed as they moved from the open plains of Apulia to the more broken country further south, where low hills and scattered groves gave way to glimpses of the sea. For some prisoners, This was the first time they had seen these lands. For others, it was a painful reminder that they were walking further and further from home. They spoke in low voices at night, trading fragments of news. One man might know the fate of a centurion. Another might have glimpsed the consul Paulus in the final moments before the lines collapsed. But the farther they traveled, the less they spoke of the battle. Hunger, thirst, and the weight of uncertainty dulled the need for detail. Some still believed Rome would come for them quickly, that a ransom would be arranged, that they would march home under guard and be exchanged before the year was out. Others, older and more cautious, knew better. Hannibal's victory had been too complete, his position in Italy too strong. Rome, wounded and defiant, might refuse to bargain at all. The truth would come later. But in those first days, the prisoners carried a fragile hope. They had survived Cannae, but survival was not yet freedom. The captives from Cannae were eventually brought to a more permanent place of confinement, not a prison in the modern sense, but a secured camp in the southern territories under Hannibal's control. Here, the reality of their situation began to take shape. The enclosure was nothing more than a ring of stakes and ditches, watched day and night by guards who knew the terrain too well to be outwitted. The prisoners slept on the bare ground or on mats woven from reeds. In summer, the heat pressed down without mercy. In rain, the soil became a shallow mire, clinging to sandals and clothing alike. Their daily ration was small, coarse bread made from barley, sometimes supplemented by whatever beans or dried fruit could be spared. Water came from nearby wells or cisterns, carried in jars and poured into shared vessels. The Carthaginian guards were not cruel for sport, but neither were they generous. The prisoners were a burden to feed, and they were kept alive for value, not comfort. Days blurred into one another. There was no training, no work beyond small chores within the enclosure. Nothing to mark the passage of time except the changing light and the return of hunger. Men formed small circles of familiarity, soldiers from the same cohort, men from the same village, and these circles became their only sense of home. Rumors arrived more often than news. Some claimed that Hannibal had offered Rome a chance to ransom them. Others swore that the Senate had already refused, without written orders or official messengers. The truth drifted in fragments. It was not long before the reality emerged. The Senate, led by voices unwilling to show weakness, had decided against paying for their release. To ransom them would be to admit the scale of the loss, to pour coin into the hands of the enemy, and perhaps to encourage future captures. The decision, made far away in the marble heart of the Republic, was a sentence of years for those now behind stakes and ditches. The effect was as heavy as the defeat itself. Some men cursed the Senate, openly swearing that Rome had abandoned them. Others defended the decision, arguing that the Republic could not bow to Hannibal, even for their sake. But all of them felt the same weight. They were no longer soldiers in the field. They were bargaining pieces that Rome had chosen not to claim. Seasons changed. The wind from the sea grew cooler, and the rains came harder. Illness spread in the damp fevers that burned through a man in days, coughs that clung for weeks. The dead were buried beyond the ditch, their names spoken quietly at night by those who had served beside them. Hannibal did not forget them entirely. From time to time, smaller exchanges of prisoners took place, officers for officers, specialists for specialists. But for the common soldier, there was no such trade. They remained where they were, their fate tied not to the next battle, but to the shifting tides of politics and the slow grind of war. And so, the men of Cannae learned that captivity was not measured in days or months, but in the steady erosion of memory, of home, of the streets of Rome, of the feel of marching in formation. They had not been killed at Cannae, but they had been taken out of the war. And for many, that was a different kind of ending. Asterisk, as the war dragged on. The prisoners from Cannae faded from the thoughts of those who still fought in the field. They became, in a sense, another front of the war, not of swords and shields, but of endurance. The camp that held them shifted location more than once. Sometimes it was moved inland, away from the sea, to keep them far from any possible rescue or escape. Other times, they were marched to settlements that had pledged themselves to Hannibal, where their presence served as a reminder of Carthage's reach. The marches were weary affairs, carried out under the same guarded watch as their first journey into captivity, though now the men's pace was slower, their bodies leaner, and their faces marked by years of sun and wind. New prisoners occasionally joined them, men taken in skirmishes or in smaller defeats elsewhere in Italy. These newcomers brought fresh accounts of the war, of Roman victories in Spain, of defeats in the south, of the long shadow Hannibal still cast over the Republic. But news was always partial, often months old by the time it reached them, and shaped by the mouths that told it. The greatest cruelty of captivity was not hunger, nor the lack of freedom, but the erosion of identity. Soldiers who had once been part of disciplined formations, with names recorded on muster rolls and voices counted in the roar of battle, now moved through their days unnamed by any official record. They became known only to each other, and even those bonds thinned as men died or were sent elsewhere. Some adapted, learning bits of the languages spoken by their guards, trading small favors for scraps of extra food. Others withdrew into silence, speaking less and less until the months passed, with barely a word. A few attempted escape, slipping away in the night, but the countryside was hostile and the distances vast. Those who were caught were brought back, bruised and bound, as a warning. Those who vanished entirely were spoken of in low voices. Whether they had reached freedom or met death on the road was unknown. Back in Rome, their absence was felt most sharply by families who had not been given bodies to bury. In the Forum, in the quiet of the temples, prayers were still offered for sons and brothers who might still live. Yet the years without word made those prayers softer, more like rituals of remembrance than hopes for return. When the war finally turned and Hannibal was pushed back toward the southern coast, some of the surviving prisoners were freed in negotiated exchanges. They returned, older, changed, their service to Rome having been years of waiting rather than fighting. They walked streets that felt narrower than they remembered, saw faces that no longer knew their names. Others never came back at all. They had died in distant camps, buried in ground that would never be called Roman, their fate marked only by the memories of the few who had stood beside them. For those who survived Cannae, only to live as prisoners. The war was not measured in battles won or lost. It was measured in seasons, in the slow passing of shadows across camp walls, in the knowledge that history will remember the day they were captured, but not the long, unseen years that followed. And in that way, they were both part of Rome's greatest defeat and among its most quietly forgotten, after Cannae. The roads to Rome lay open in a way they had not since the earliest days of the Republic. Hannibal's army was bloodied but unbroken, his cavalry still strong, his reputation now towering over Italy. In the minds of many, the next step was obvious: march on the city itself and end the war in a single stroke. But Hannibal did not come. Instead, he moved north at a measured pace, shadowed by his cavalry, gathering allies from the towns that saw in his victory a chance to break free of Rome. The news of Cannae raced ahead of him, carried by riders and rumor. In villages and farms along the way, people spoke of the slaughter in low voices, as though the dead might hear in Rome. The Senate met in near constant session. The walls were manned, the gates fortified, the sacred shields and standards brought out in solemn procession, to remind the people that the city still stood. Women were ordered to remain indoors, not as punishment, but to keep the streets clear for troop movements, and to present an image of order to any watching eyes. The city's defenders were not fresh legions, but the remnants of older ones, veterans unfit for long marches, young men barely trained, and freedmen who had been promised their liberty in exchange for service. The fields around Rome saw the hurried digging of ditches and the raising of palisades, not because anyone knew exactly where Hannibal might appear, but because no one wanted to be unprepared if he did. Hannibal, meanwhile, camped within reach of the capital, yet chose not to attack. Ancient writers debated his reasons. Some said his army, victorious but exhausted, needed time to recover. Others claimed he lacked the siege equipment to take a city as well defended as Rome. There were whispers, too, that he expected the city to surrender without a fight, that the weight of Cannae's laws would break its will. But Rome did not yield. Messengers were sent to every allied town still loyal to the Republic, calling for reinforcements and supplies. The Tiber was watched day and night for signs of enemy scouts. Inside the city, life narrowed to essentials. Grain was rationed, movement restricted, speeches kept brief and to the point. The siege never came in the way people imagined. No massed assault, no walls battered by rams, no ladders swarming with enemy troops. It came instead as a presence, a shadow at the edge of the horizon. The knowledge that the man who had destroyed an army larger than the population of some cities was close enough to reach them, but chose to wait. And that waiting, that not knowing when or if he would strike, was its own kind of siege. Asterisk, the days after Hannibal halted within striking distance of Rome were marked not by the clash of armies, but by a peculiar, heavy quiet. No enemy standards appeared on the skyline. No war horns echoed across the fields. Yet the city lived as though the attack might come with the next dawn. In the Forum, business continued in a muted form. Traders still sold grain, oil, and cloth, but their voices were lower, their eyes flicking toward the Capitoline Hill, where the Senate met behind guarded doors. Every rumor that leaked from those meetings seemed to contradict the last. Some claimed Hannibal was moving closer, others that he had begun to turn away. On the city walls, sentries kept constant watch. They stood in pairs, scanning the roads, the river crossings, the distant dust clouds that might be marching columns or simply the wind across the dry fields. At night, the torches along the ramparts were kept burning until dawn, their light flickering on armor that had not been polished in days. Inside the homes of the city, the sense of confinement grew. Families stored what food they could, drawing water before the wells might be put under guard. Children were kept indoors, their games quiet, their laughter subdued. Women lit the household altars each morning, offering incense to whatever gods might hold the enemy back. Meanwhile, in the countryside, just beyond Rome's reach, Hannibal's presence was felt more directly. His cavalry ranged far, gathering supplies, testing the reactions of Roman patrols. Farms were stripped of their harvests, livestock driven away, and villages left empty as residents fled toward the safety of the city's walls. Hannibal himself, according to later accounts, rode out to survey Rome from a distance. From certain hills, the city could be seen in its entirety, the walls, the temples, the clustered roofs inside. Some sources claim he studied it in silence, others that he laughed at its defenses. But whatever passed through his mind, he did not give the order to attack.